What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'm in the Florida Panhandle on the Gulf Coast, and we're going to be diving the fishing pier at night. I've come up here and dove the pier during the day, and there's an insane amount of marine life that hangs out under the pier in the day, but I've always wondered what's out there at night. So my friends Jesse and Ariel are with me tonight, and our goal is to make it to the end of the pier. It's about a quarter-mile long, and just see what marine life is living around the pylon. So excited to see what we find. I don't think I have Thalassophobia or Thalassophobia, whatever it is, the fear of like really deep water, but tonight's gonna be put to the test. So see how it goes out there. Hopefully the viz is looking good and see some cool wildlife. Hope you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you out there. It's very dark. Although the Gulf had been relatively flat the past few days, the waves were starting to pick up again, and it was a bit of a battle getting my fins on and moving away from the beach. As soon as I turned the camera around and hit my lights, my heart honestly sank a little bit. Visibility was worse than I had hoped. However, I still managed to stumble across the stingray pretty quickly. But the waves were churning up so much sand, the beams from my dive lights were reflecting back at me, making it pretty difficult to see far underwater. Despite the conditions, we pushed on, and I followed after the stingray for a bit. This is either a southern or blunt-nosed stingray. It's pretty hard to tell them apart when they're this size. Close by the stingray, I saw the familiar striping of a sheep's head. These fish have weirdly human-looking teeth, which they use to eat hard-shelled invertebrates like mollusks and crustaceans. But sadly, he was shy and wouldn't show me his face before he and the stingray vanished into the dark. I was about a third of the way down the pier at this point, so I popped my head up to check it out. It's a pretty foreboding structure in the dark, and I pretty quickly went back to keeping my head on a swivel below the surface. Suddenly, something caught my eye on the ocean floor. I dove down, and to my great displeasure, realized I was looking at the cross-section of a large fish. And to top it all off, not far away was the lifeless back half of another fish. These were definitely left behind by fishermen, but I wasn't counting on there being additional chum in the water besides myself. I fought off my fears and stayed calm, but man, I'm not gonna lie, this really freaked me out. Powering on, I came across a group of some decent-sized redfish. So far, these were the biggest fish I had seen. About halfway to the end of the pier, the water became shallow as I passed over the sandbar. I came across a much bigger stingray. This guy was about 4 feet long to the tip of his tail. Even so, these guys can get way bigger. It felt like the pylons were going on forever, and as I left the sandbar behind me, the water became deep and dark. I had to turn my lights into narrow mode in order to maximize the distance I could see underwater. It was so eerie seeing fish suddenly appear illuminated out of nowhere in the darkness. Thankfully, the tip of the pier was in sight because I was nearing my limit.
Alright, that's it to the pier. But to the bottom. Ready to go back.
Before I left the tip of the pier though, of course, I had to dive down through the dark and touch the ocean floor. So I did. You can just see my hand hit the sand right here. There was a lot of loud crackling noises on the bottom of the ocean, and let me tell you, I shot back up to the surface. But once I made it back to the surface, I still had to be as calm as possible. As much as I wanted to see a shark, I didn't want them approaching me due to some splashing. I didn't even film again until I got back to the sandbar. I was so ready to get out of the water. I spotted another redfin cruising about, but wasn't having much luck otherwise. As much as I wanted to get back on land, I was a little disappointed we hadn't seen more wildlife. But then, another ray caught my eye, and this one looked very different than the first two. I got closer and turned my lights down a bit. This was no ordinary ray. This, in fact, was a lesser electric ray. It was my first time ever encountering one in the wild. Lesser electric rays have no barbed stinger, but instead have two kidney-shaped organs on the sides of their head that are capable of delivering an electric shock of 14 to 37 volts. Now, this isn't enough to seriously hurt a human, but it would probably knock you down if you accidentally stepped on one. The rays use their electrical abilities to defend themselves against predators and also to stun their prey, which for the most part is marine worms. It's pretty wild that an animal has the ability to deliver an electric shock on demand. As scary as the dive beneath the pier had been, if I hadn't pushed through it, I might never have had the chance to see this amazing little zappy creature. Just like that, the dive was completely worth it for me. The rest of the swim back went by fairly quickly. I came across a couple spadefish hanging out near the bottom. They sometimes gather in huge schools beneath the pier, but tonight they're pretty scattered. A little further along I saw a kingfish, but it didn't stick around. Although I'd already passed what felt like hundreds of pylons, I finally took a closer look at one. There was a surprising amount of life and color clinging to the cement columns. The coastal marine environment along much of the Florida Panhandle can be almost like an aquatic desert, but even the cover and support offered by these man-made structures can quickly become habitat for all sorts of wildlife. By now, I was past the sandbar, and although I still was keeping my eyes peeled underwater, I really zoomed back to shore. Alright, well that was both scarier and less climactic than I thought it'd be. I thought for sure we'd get some sharks out there, but still saw some cool stuff. It definitely got pretty spooky out there at the tip of the pier. Yeah, I think the depth out there is like 30, 35 feet, and I couldn't see past 20 feet with my lights. There's just so much stuff stirred up in the water, but still a cool experience. I think we might try and go on the sound side, on the other side of the island. There's water's a little bit flatter out there, so might be able to see some cool stuff on some artificial reefs over there. So we're gonna go check it out. The sound side was totally flat. It was a nice change of pace from the deep, choppy water below the fishing pier. It wasn't long before we cruised up on a flounder, laying almost invisible in the sand. If it wasn't for those bulging eyeballs, I probably never would have even seen it. It's crazy to think that one of their eyes starts out on the right side of their body and then migrates to the left side. Flatfish are so bizarre. The water was definitely calmer on the sound side, but the visibility was only a little bit better than the ocean had been. We kept going across the sandy flats that looked almost like endless dunes, before we eventually made it to the artificial reef about 50 yards offshore. There was an odd assortment of cement structures that sea urchins had completely taken over. I even saw a sleeping fish inside one of the hollowed out structures. You couldn't see the reef from the surface, but it was pretty wild to dive down and suddenly see these gloomy looking pieces of cement covered in brilliant purple sea urchins. There were a couple that were lighter colored and stood out from the rest, but I think they were mostly the same species, but I'm not entirely positive. On the way back to shore, we got really lucky and came across a squid hanging out in the open. If you look carefully, you can actually see it change colors from red to white before jetting away. A lot of cephalopods, like squids, octopuses, and cuttlefish, have the ability to change the color and texture of their skin on demand. It's pretty neat to see just for getting a brief glimpse of the squid. Jesse and Ariel had to head out, but I wanted to patrol the shallows a little bit longer in hopes of getting a better shot of a flounder. I didn't get a better shot of a flounder, but I did come across what was hands down one of the cutest fish I've ever seen. In the distance, I noticed a small floating blob hovering over the sand, and sure enough, it turned out to be a striped burrfish. Striped burrfish are pretty small and usually only grow to be less than a foot long. Burrfish are a type of pufferfish, but unlike other puffers, they have spines or burrs that are always out. They use water to inflate their bodies and make themselves bigger and more difficult for predators to swallow. After all, it's pretty easy to choke on a spiky ball. The diversity in species of pufferfish and burrfish in the world's oceans actually is a pretty good indication that this is a really effective survival strategy. Finding this little guy was a pretty great way to end the night, so I watched him for a little bit and then decided it was time to call it. Alright, so, do I have thalassophobia? I had to look up how to pronounce it. I mean, to some extent, yeah. I got up to the end of the pier and couldn't see the bottom, and I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty freaky. Do more freshwater stuff than marine stuff. Hoping to do more marine stuff in the future, but yeah, it's a little bit new for me, and I do know the Gulf and I know what wildlife might be out there and that it's likely not going to be very interested in me. It's going to be scared of me, but being in deep water and not being able to see what's around you, I think is a pretty natural fear. Very happy to have my friends out there in a paddleboard not far off. Still did it, and I don't really have any desire to do it again unless conditions improve significantly. I still saw some cool wildlife, but I'm afraid my cinematography was way below par this time, and that's because conditions were poopy. But some of those rays were awesome. The little pufferfish and the flounders, getting to go out on the bay side, it's kind of neat. So yeah, but anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all in the next one, hopefully with better conditions and me a little less nervous. See ya.